ripping apart to pieces the American satellite constellation, which provided their communications slash IT and ISR based capabilities high in the sky. SC-19, FK-2000, DN-2, DN-3, S-500, and even DEW, or directed energy, and laser-based weaponry, was now in the process at midnight of completely nullifying these capabilities alongside of the crippling cyber strike that was launched by coalition forces against anything and all things tied to the internet within the nation, which included its power and water grid, as well as internet services, telecom, and even military networks, as they too were connected to the internet and thus could be hacked and brought to their knees. In addition to this, crippling electronic warfare capabilities, whether land, air, or on coastal areas sea-based, had completely removed redundant radio communications, as well as ISR capabilities such as generator-powered portable radars like multi-mission radars and air defense radars, for example, as well as also even drone-based capabilities, effectively thrusting America back into the Stone Age in the figurative sense, as they were in a worse position even than the Iraqis in the first Gulf War, as this was the most comparable situation to effectively compare the current situation in the opening of this invasion to. As the fighting was breaking out at midnight through the use of the brand new innovative fourth generation warfare doctrine of invasion, the Trojan shock armies were now the figurative star of the show, if you will, as they were the forces that were carrying out the capture and or clearance or destruction of all major key objectives throughout the land, as well as tying down in the process and eliminating all pockets of resistance, enabling the externals, who essentially took a backseat to the Trojans, to act as the heavy-handed reinforcements of the Trojan shock forces as they smashed through the proverbial door and raced deep inland inside of the nation upon having had crossed the borders, as there would be some initial border battles in other areas, such as where the external invasion prong of PLA Group Armies 1 through 6 and the 41st Russian Combined Arms Army had crossed the border. They essentially faced no resistance and were able to race on to Big Spring, Texas, which was immediately to east of the Midland-Odessa Twin Cities area, where a major key logistical dump sat for these forces to essentially refuel and, if needed, rearm and conduct any needed maintenance procedures before continuing on to the next stop, which was located in the city of Lubbock, before then continuing on into the Texas Panhandle, where they would reach Amarillo before spreading out in their different army-sized elements, whether group armies in the PLA or the 41st Russian Combined Arms Army, which would be shed off en route in Lubbock as well. As the American defensive planning was to be sort of an elastic defense plan, if you will, using active duty Army and even Marine Corps ground forces as sort of fire brigades to act as reinforcements for any spread out defending forces, as the Americans had been busy mustering National Guard and reservists to defend sites that were critical to national security throughout many of their major and medium-sized cities. The ability for the active duty forces to essentially act as reinforcements for the spread out defenders would be nullified, as the invasion plan, essentially at the operational level, had every single solitary campaign acting as a cog in a well-oiled machine, as in what occurred in one campaign directly affected what occurred in nearby campaigns and elsewhere throughout the land, as the opening of the invasion in the far west of the south central invasion sector, which essentially was Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico, would see the PLA's 14th Group Army, as well as the People's Armed Police 18th Light Armored Brigade, assaulting the El Paso and Fort Bliss area from outside in Mexico, while inside on CCP regime properties, the Trojan Unit, which was the 14th Pakistani Infantry Division, broke out of their CCP regime properties and abruptly assisted in the surrounding and destruction of all of the active duty Army units stationed on Fort Bliss, including the 1st Armored Division, as well as also air defense and other forces that were stationed on this post, as the SEAD operations were carried out not only by the artillery of the ground forces in this operation, but also by the coalition's air power and missile power from the missile forces of the coalition. The ability to provide air defense cover for nearby friendly defending units operating in western Texas or in New Mexico was immediately nullified by these SEAD operations, as well as the ability to provide any sorts of reinforcements which would not be forthcoming to any defenders in the region, as the Fort Bliss campaign was opening up and other campaigns throughout the South Central invasion sector simultaneously. In the air, the American air power, which was also another aspect of its air defense capabilities, was also completely nullified, as most American air power would be destroyed on the ground, with very little of it airborne or even getting airborne at the opening of the invasion, as 130 miles to the north of Midland-Odessa in the skies near Lubbock, 2 PLAAF fighter squadrons using their beyond visual range missile capabilities would swat down an entire American fighter squadron, even catching up with a few straggling aircraft from the squadron and finishing them off with moderate range PL-12 air-to-air missiles, as the KJ-2000, an AWACS aircraft, effectively directing the air campaign in this particular portion of the South Central invasion sector, would enter behind the coalition's fighter power and begin to orbit the battle space over the Midland-Odessa skies. It would continue to direct air operations over this particular zone in the South Central invasion sector, as the ground operations erupted immediately at midnight in the Midland-Odessa battle space. The 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division was now in the process of beginning its operations with a thunderous artillery barrage. Although it only had 2 battalions of artillery, 1 per each of its comprising 2 brigades, the 56 howitzers in each battalion would be shifting their fire constantly throughout this operation, as well as also the coalition providing devastating air power in the form of the Iranian Air Force contributed Su-24 strike aircraft squadron, as well as also the PLAAF, or Chinese Air Force's contributed JH-7 strike aircraft squadron, as well as even strikes from the missile forces of the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, as they had 3 of their missile brigades from the Eastern Theater Command deployed in the South Central invasion sector, 2 of which were in Mexico, and were bolstered even by called-up reserve battalions in addition to the active-duty battalions that already comprised these brigades, as well as also the 616th, a Trojan unit in eastern Texas. However, the 616th would not be participating in the campaign unfolding in Midland-Odessa. Only the 612th and 613th would be firing cruise and tactical ballistic missiles at targets in this battle space, as the 2 brigades comprising the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division each had their own assigned sector within the Midland-Odessa battle space. The 2nd Brigade handled the Midland side of the operation, whereas the 1st Brigade handled the Odessa side, as military targets were of the most critical importance throughout this operation. They were naturally targeted first and with the heaviest firepower available, as also there were infrastructure and economic objectives involved in the Midland-Odessa campaign as well, as it sat in the Permian Basin, which was a massively energy-rich area, as well as also resource-rich in minerals and metals. This was critical to Chinese colonization operations post-invasion, and thus the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division had been chosen to subdue and then occupy this area post-invasion, as they were a highly skilled and even combat experienced force, as they had crushed insurgents in Xinjiang and even some in Tibet for decades, and had finally honed their combat skills in the process, and thus were also trained and able to take on actual enemy military forces in addition to this, as they had been deployed to this area in particular due to their counterinsurgency skills, in addition to the American military and alphabet paramilitary defenders were also well-organized, well-funded, well-trained, and well-armed militia forces, which could be devastating as partisan or insurgent elements, and thus the 2nd PAP Light Armored Division had been chosen for this task. As the first forces to bear the brunt of the onslaught were the American military and alphabet paramilitary regime forces of the American regime, the militia forces would also be assaulted in many cases in flank clearance operations to ensure that the primary objectives could be driven on without interference. Also, in the process of the capture and or destruction and clearance of objectives was also ensuring that the American defending forces could not move further to the east, where they could cause trouble for the advance of the external invasion prong of PLA Group Armies 1 through 6 and the 41st Russian Combined Arms Army moving to Big Spring, which was a major depot just to the east of the Midland-Odessa battle space, as the cohesion of the massive miles-long convoy could be disrupted by any defending forces, which would throw off the timetable, as they were on a strict timetable to rapidly get inland, and thus the 2nd PAP Light Armored Division had to contain this pocket of resistance and eliminate it to enable the rapid drive inland of this external invasion prong. As the two comprising brigades of the 2nd PAP Light Armored Division each had an artillery battalion with 56 howitzers apiece, as they had 6 firing batteries of 8 Type 83 towed 122 millimeter howitzers in each firing battery, as well as a firing battery of 8 Type 59-IR-1 130 millimeter howitzers, which were slightly more powerful, and of course their headquarters and support battery, which were the command and logistical elements over the entire battalion. These artillery battalions would be massively shifting their fire throughout the course of this operation, as the artillery, being slightly more limited than in certain other battle spaces, would stay massively busy as they were operating truly in a target-rich environment. As in addition to eliminating enemy command and control, in any successful invasion operation, the destruction of enemy logistics was also paramount. And at the opening of this invasion, the artillery heavily focused upon the command and control center, which was the Midland International Air and Spaceport, as the 2nd Brigade's Artillery Battalion shifted the vast majority of its firepower against defenders around the airport and even in some cases within it, as they had to be extremely cautious not to hit critical infrastructure that was to be seized intact, while the Artillery Battalion of the 1st Brigade was most heavily focused on the destruction of the U.S. Army National Guard Armory, which hosted at the time the 106th Brigade Support Battalion, which was the chief logistical force within the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, as not only were they the major logistical force in the area, but they were providing logistical support to the Alpha Company, which was a combat company from the larger 1st of the 635th Armored Battalion, while the rest of the 1st of the 635th was deployed to defend the airport. Alpha Company was deployed to the Odessa Municipal Airport, which was an excellent position as it provided them a position from which they could utilize the major roads in the area to quickly conduct aggressive patrolling or provide assistance to other defenders in the region in this part of the battle space. As the 106 was being heavily pounded at the opening by artillery within the first 30 minutes. From 12:30 and onward, the 1st Brigade's artillery would shift most of its fire to hit the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion, which was another combat battalion in addition to the 1st of the 635th Armored Battalion, as these combat engineers had recently constructed a forward operating base for and by themselves, which was immediately adjacent and to the north of the ICE Detention Center, also built in recent times, as this center would house violent illegal migrants who were to be deported. And the objective of the People's Armed Police and even another paramilitary force, the 350th Battalion of the 7th Division of the National Production and Construction Corps, which hailed from Xinjiang, would commit forces to this operation, as the 350th Battalion was comprised of 3 sapper companies, which were effectively paramilitary combat engineers, as well as 3 companies of civil engineers. Although they were armed and combat trained, they were non-combat forces, as they were primarily geared toward construction operations, as well as a building supply quartermaster company and their headquarters and support company, which were the command and logistics of their battalion. They would commit to battle 2 of their sapper companies moving from the east towards the west to help an armored battalion of the 1st Brigade of the 2nd PAP Light Armored Division in their assault against this facility, as it was 2 facilities in one. It was the FOB of the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion, mobilized to assist in the border operations that occurred in this area, as before the mobilization effort went into effect, even before the Sino-Russian naval drills, this area had been a hub of border-related activities, as Customs and Border Patrol had offices in the city of Midland, as did the DEA and IRS. There were already paramilitary forces in Midland before even more were mobilized and sent to the ICE Detention Center and other related facilities to man these centers, as the 150th was to provide direct support and defense for the ICE forces. They would be heavily attacked by the 1st Brigade of the People's Armed Police 2nd Light Armored Division, as by 12:30, as the artillery would shift from hitting the forces in Odessa, in the north of Odessa, they would then begin to hit the 150th and paramilitary defenders on site, as the howitzers would once again reorient their fire to this area. Within the first 30 minutes, before all of the firepower in earnest would begin to hit this facility and its defenders, the defenders, as we go to the map of this particular area, in this 2-mile north-south area by 1.5-mile east-west area, the defenders had an excellent defensive setup in terms of the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion's forward operating base, as essentially it was constructed as a massive berm surrounding their site, which contained a large motor pool for their vehicles of their 5 comprising companies, which was their HHC, or Headquarters and Headquarters Company, and their 4 combat companies, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, and Delta, as well as a mess tent, as well as also the living area tents for their troops, and the buildings for their S shops, or S1 through S6, and their commander's portable building as well, and a communications building, and a gym, as this was a semi-permanent arrangement for the 150th, as they could possibly be deployed here for an extended amount of time, They had also fortified the area with anti-tank mines surrounding much of the facility to protect from V-bed attacks or vehicle-borne improvised devices or other vehicle-based attacks, as they assumed that perhaps cartels or other bad actors could attack their facility. It was well defended against direct fire or fire that was fired at them from the ground, as the berm provided massive protection from many types of munitions and firepower, and the anti-tank mines and the concertina wire fencing outside of that prevented infiltration attempts from bad actors, whether fifth column, foreign intelligence agents, saboteurs, or again cartels or certain types of groups of bad actors such as terrorists and others. However, the coalition that invaded the nation needed none of these sorts of groups, as the largest ever invasion force in all human history was about to come bearing down on the country, including this particular area, as this coalition, 12.5 million strong, was the largest assembled military and even paramilitary force combined ever seen in all of human recorded history, as the ICE detention center immediately to the south was built like a fortress, as it had concrete T-walls as its outer wall, as well as also a side which was devoted to the ICE paramilitary forces, as they had overflow living tent areas. They also had portable buildings, and they had a concrete building recently built in this area, which was their administrative, communication, and command building. They also had helipads, as the ICE forces of the paramilitary, part of the DHS more broadly, operated rotary aircraft, including Black Hawk helicopters, which were active in this particular region and were assisting in the overall defensive effort, as they could provide logistical and airlift support to the ground forces, including even working with the military forces, who, for their part, in this region, did not have any aviation assets of their own and thus worked closely with ICE. As the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion's FOB was effectively connected to the ICE detention center through a narrow corridor, which was comprised of a gravel road and concertina wire surrounding this narrow corridor. It connected the northern gatehouses, the northern entrance to the detention center, through which the gravel road continued out of the main entrance in the south of it, where outside of it on the main road was the guard shack and a gate to allow for vehicles to move to the main guardhouses where they would be let in. On the detention center side were the tents wherein were kept the detainees, as there were massive holding cells of chain link fences inside of these tents, and there were 3 and 4 tier bunk beds, the maximum capacity being 40,000. However, it was run over capacity, of course, like many government facilities. It had a gate for entry and another gate for entry to this parking lot, wherein food deliveries, as this was the food prep, processing, and admin building for the detention side, food trucks and deliveries for food would come in through this way. The gate would close, they would wait, the gate would open, they would come in, make their deliveries, and then leave in the same way. Or detainees being brought in would be brought into this parking area and thus brought in the same manner, as this was a chain link fencing where the guards could go out and effectively walk patrols. And this was the concrete T-walls. These were HESCO barrier guard towers in the facility, which were essentially made of HESCO barriers with a guard tower on top, each guard tower having 2 M250 cal heavy machine guns issued to the ICE paramilitary forces, with the concrete T-walls spaced between 3 and 4 inches apart to provide gun ports for defense from external attack. As outside of these walls was an additional concertina wire fence. This was only on the detention side of the facility. Therefore, if anyone escaped somehow over the concrete T-walls, they would be held up by this concertina wire fencing and spotted by guards and either captured or eliminated in the process. As the facility was highly coveted intact, there would be very limited strikes from artillery on the facility, mostly targeting vehicles in the parking lot or the overflow tent areas, while the concrete T-walls would essentially be spared. The tops of these guard towers would be fired upon and destroyed because they had to be due to the positioning of the M250 cal heavy machine guns. They could be replaced and rebuilt easily. As the rest of the facility was wanted highly intact, it would have to be breached and cleared by the coalition forces, which included the 2 sapper companies from the 350th Battalion of the 7th Division of the National Construction and Production Corps, and 3 companies would assault from the armored battalion committed from the 1st Brigade of the 2nd People's Armed Police Light Armored Division, as these forces would sweep in as they would break out of their CCP regime property nearly 5 miles to the northwest of the facility. They would race towards the facility, and the 3 attacking companies would fan out and have fields of fire controlling the entire area, while the same would be the case with the 2 sapper companies attacking from the 350th that had been committed to this battle, as the artillery support would be mostly heavy against the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion. This artillery would again begin 30 minutes into the invasion, as for the first 30 minutes, the artillery was oriented at striking the logistical forces that even provided logistical support to this facility from the Army National Guard Armory, which was the 106th Brigade Support Battalion. Again, it's always critically important to destroy enemy logistics, denying the combat forces badly needed supplies. In the first 30 minutes, the defenders already had 2 Black Hawk helicopters airborne who were able, with their night vision goggles from aboard the helicopters, although after the tandem anti-sat, cyber, and even electronic warfare asset usage, were unable to properly navigate and fly safely in their helicopters. However, they were effectively doing everything manually, but could see dust clouds off in the distance, which were kicked up by the arriving light tanks, the Type 62Gs rolling into the area, as well as also their accompanying armored infantry in their Type 86G IFVs and Type 63 armored personnel carriers. As these vehicles kicked up massive dust clouds, the wheel-based vehicles coming in from the east, consisting of the 2 sapper companies, were not noticed immediately as they were taking roads, and they were also wheel-based vehicles and weighed far less, as these other armored vehicles spread out into the dusty, deserty grassland plains, kicking up all of this dust. The personnel aboard these helicopters within the first 30 minutes had fast-roped an ICE agent to rapidly spread word in the forward operating base of what they had seen, and they quickly moved south into the detention center and did the same, giving, therefore, some notice to the defenders of what was coming, causing the Alpha Company and the Bravo Company of the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion to get out first and to move out of the facility to the FOB's main entrance in the northwest and to the south out of the main entrance of the ICE detention center, while the People's Armed Police companies were rolling into the area, as well as also the 2 companies of sappers coming from the east, from the 350th. As the defenders were now getting ready for a fight, they did not know that they were about to be struck by 2 cruise missiles, DH-10As, fired by a called-up reserve battalion, part of the 612th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade across the border in Mexico, as well as also about to be pounded from the air by a pair of Iranian Su-24 strike aircraft, each one dropping 8,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions onto this forward operating base in a concentrated area, which would cause enormous destruction to the forces that were unable to escape on time, as they were stuck in the motor pool, as it took a bit of time in this small area for these forces to vacate the premises. as now all of this firepower was coming in by 1230. The forces that remained, effectively the HHC and the Delta and Charlie companies, who were now trying to get out and move south, would be crushed by the force of this massive aerial pummeling of air-to-ground munitions, as well as 2 strikes from the DH-10A cruise missiles, as these were the destructive radius of these missiles, just hitting the living areas. By this point in time, the Alpha Company was already getting out the main gate in the north, which was defended by 2 sandbag positions, in addition to 2 command-detonated Claymore mines, which would end up never being used, as the People's Armed Police light tanks would sit a bit off into the distance, where they would carry out their attacks against the platoons comprising Alpha Company as they escaped to the northwest out the main gate, while other platoons tried to circumnavigate the facility, as again, they were not aware that the 2 sapper companies coming in on roads from the east were moving in this direction, as again, the dust clouds had only been observed by air to the northwest as these companies moved into position around the facility, and therefore the sappers moved in almost completely unnoticed, and thus elements of this particular sapper company would move to this particular area and pin in place for artillery strikes 2 platoons of Alpha Company, its headquarters platoon and one of its 2 combat platoons, who would try their best to fight these forces in savage combat across State Highway 385. As in this particular area, the facilities were built in a massively open, undeveloped area, which was surrounded by roads, which mostly hosted ranches and farms, as wheat and even grapes and other crops were grown in this area, as well as also this being prime grazing land. There's also oil storage facilities and oil derricks spread throughout the countryside. In this area, there was an RV park and a gas station and ranch and country homes spread throughout this particular area. Due to it being on the edge of the Llano Estacado, which was a high, deserty grassland plain, being on the very border with the Chihuahuan Desert, the terrain variations, whereas most of the terrain in the Midland-Odessa area was more flat with very mild undulations, this area had far more hilly terrain, as the hills would provide a small measure of protection in some instances. It would ultimately end up not being enough due to the arrival of the People's Armed Police CH-901A loitering munitions, which would enter the area and cause massive devastation, as they were equipped with heat warheads and would smash into vehicle targets especially, although they would also hit some dismounted infantry targets, as some personnel were very wise and would try to hide in washouts and wadis located throughout the area, which would give them actually substantial cover from many types of attacks, as this would be a very savage battle, as by 1230 it was kicking off in a very brutal way. The missile strikes, airstrikes onto this area, as they destroyed all of these portable buildings and all of the vehicles of both the Charlie and Delta Company in conjunction with the missile strikes, and now the artillery beginning to crash into this area hardcore. The forces in the small corridor that connected the 2 facilities were now in the fight of their life, as those that guarded the southern entry into the FOB, which was a squad that had been rotated in for guard duty, were now being struck by artillery and shells from light tanks, as the light tank platoons of the Type 62Gs were now moving in for the kill, as they already destroyed this guard shack along the main road and the gate. They were also with loitering munition strikes in the process of ripping apart the vehicles that had gotten out the main gate, already destroying the M1150 armored engineering vehicle of the 1st Platoon of Alpha Company with a combination of different weapon systems, as in this animation or illustration. The turret gunner operating his M250 cal is trying to lay down return fire, preparing to also, within the vehicle, the crew members fire off the rocket-guided C4 line-clearing charges at enemy forces, which were mostly used against minefields and obstacles, were now being used in an attack against the attacking light tanks, which were opening fire with tank shells, as well as 12.7 millimeter ammunition from the tank turret gunners, and some even firing ATGMs from the barrels of their 105 millimeter high-velocity rifled tank guns, as the combat engineers were fighting desperately to escape the area, thinking they could escape to the east to get away, as the massive air, missile, and artillery strikes had begun to come in on their FOB. The 2nd platoon, a combat platoon, and the headquarters platoon, by the time making it here, as the quadcopter assets were mapping the area in real time, plotting every enemy position on the map, as all friendly positions were known, as every vehicle and tablet operated by the squad-level NCO acted also as a transponder for the rough position of their forces. The plotting of enemy forces was sent back to the combat data links, as well as also to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which put together the pre-prepared strike packages for artillery, air, missile forces, and more. By the time these two platoons reached this point, as the 1st platoon, a combat platoon, their vehicles broke off of their formation to provide a rear guard action to these forces trying to flee to the east, who would end up being pinned down, as this particular sapper company, having had moved into place, consisting of its sapper combat recon platoon, equipped with their EQ 2050 high mobility up-armored vehicles, which was China's answer to the American Humvee. This one equipped with a Jiangxi 12.7mm Gatling autocannon, which could lay down a massive wall of lead at a far higher rate of speed than a standard 12.7mm heavy machine gun, remote-controlled from in the vehicle. As these forces approached the highway 385 from the east, they would enter the highway to cross it to carry out their main assault against the facility coming from the east. They would utilize, as these were paramilitary combat engineers, their widely mass-produced, in freakish quantities, DJI disposable demolition robots, each carrying a C4 demolition charge, which would destroy these concertina wire barriers and enable the armed combat robots, their quad-legged robots equipped with 12.7mm heavy machine guns, to enter this area and fire through the portholes at the defenders to support the assaulting sapper forces, who would have to repel over the walls to enter the facility. As these troops, being effectively third-rate paramilitary forces, were equipped with older Chinese small arms, such as the Type 56 assault rifles, as well as the Type 67 general-purpose machine guns, this man having it strapped to him to better control it while firing on the move, feeding a belt of ammunition into it. These forces, despite being equipped with hand-me-down small arms from the military, were also equipped with anti-tank guided missiles, such as HJ-08s, robotic technologies, such as their quad-legged assault, as well as non-combat robots, which were perfect for removing obstacles and demolition charges, as well as planting demolition charges and helping create obstacles even, as they were dual purpose. And these would also help clear obstructions to enable the armed combat robots and the sappers to assault the facility and effectively repel into the facility from over the concrete T-walls, which they badly did not want to destroy. As you can see, their ICE defenders are firing through their firing ports, trying to hit the defending forces that were inside. As now Not only were these forces fighting from the east, but also from the west. The People's Armed Police would likewise breach the facility in the same manner as they would repel over the walls, as the armored infantry troops would also be tasked with clearing the facility of all defending forces alongside of the sappers of the 350th Battalion, the two sapper companies committed to this fight. As the People's Armed Police and sappers would work together in this endeavor, the PAP would clearly provide the bulk of the firepower with their light tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers, as well as loitering munitions. As now, within the first 30 minutes of battle from the arrival of these forces at 12:30 and onwards, the fighting would be heavy, including not just in the north, where Alpha Company of the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion had escaped the FOB, but also in the south, where Bravo, having had crossed into the ICE detention center on the gravel road, would escape the facility from the main entrance in the south, ending up in a battle on a ranch with a PAP light tank company. As again, People's Armed Police, the armored battalion committed, only would commit 3 of its 7 combat companies, of course not counting its headquarters and support company, which was sitting further back on the CCP regime properties, running supplies to the combat companies at the battle. The 3 assaulting companies, 1 light tank company in the south, 1 light tank company in the north, and in the center, the armored infantry company committed, would have total firepower dominance in this battle, as well as fields of fire that covered virtually all avenues of escape on this battlefield. As this Bravo company of combat engineers moved into place, the headquarters platoon, with its mostly soft-skinned military vehicles following behind the combat engineers, with the small exception of engineering vehicles and others, the 2 combat platoons moving into place would get in a direct battle with the platoons from this light tank company, as there were 4 combat platoons, 5 Type 62G light tanks each, with the headquarters platoon sitting just off map, providing armored recovery and combat medic support to these tank crews. The PAP would end up losing some of their light tanks in battle, as again, although the missile shortage for the Americans was critical in terms of anti-tank guided missiles and even SHORAD air defense systems such as Stinger missiles, the platoons of combat engineers had only 1 man-portable ATGM each in the form of a Javelin system. As these were National Guardsmen, they were not given the same high-priority status as active duty forces. However, they would use these weapons somewhat effectively in this battle, as at this particular ranch, in this animation or illustration, it perfectly details the type of fighting occurring. As you can see, these combat engineers are in a wadi or a washout on the property, and these Type 62G light tanks in the near distance are approaching the area, firing their turret heavy 12.7 millimeter machine guns, as well as tank shells such as Frag T and HE shells at the forces in the area, as they would destroy the vehicles rather quickly, but would have a harder time rooting out the infantry, as they were in excellent positions, almost like being dug in. Quadcopter assets, seeing everything going on and guiding the firepower of the coalition. Ultimately, the loitering munitions would end up solving the problem by striking forces from overhead in these washout positions. However, not before the People's Armed Police Company in the south would end up losing 3 light tanks. 1 would be lost by a rapidly fired tow missile from a Bradley that would manage to end up hitting and destroying this light tank, as this was the armored recovery vehicle, the Type 84 armored recovery vehicle, and combat medics coming in to check to make sure there was any survivors and pull out the KIAs. They would remove the vehicle from this platoon as the fighting was going on, and these other light tanks were providing fire support. Initially, the guard tower was taken out by a frag T shell from this light tank before it was destroyed, while there were ICE personnel trying to fire through the portholes at the attacking armored infantry, who were returning fire but ensuring that they didn't use weapons that would destroy the concrete T-walls completely, as also loitering munition strikes would hit targets along these walls as well to enable the repelling actions of two of the three combat platoons of this armored infantry company, as their headquarters platoon was to the rear of their positions and off the map. They would provide any needed logistical support by running ammo to the troops that were fighting at the lines of contact. As the fighting picked up at the ranch property, one platoon of light tanks moving into place was moving along the main road to cut off an avenue of escape to the southwest, as they would also lose one of their light tanks in the process, as one of the soldiers of these squads, as these vehicles would be taken out rapidly by the shells from the light tanks, as the People's Armed Police light tanks were pounding and shredding apart these vehicles, including the platoon's engineering vehicle, the M1150, as well as also their Bradleys, completely annihilating them and the crews inside with their heat shells, as well as also continuing to fire frag T shells at dismounted infantry, or dismounted combat engineers, rather. The platoon's Javelin ATGM would be used by one of these squad members in this squad taking position along this hilly terrain to take out another People's Armed Police Type 62G light tank with the top attack mode of this particular ATGM, before the remaining four light tanks would continue to lay down heavy fire, annihilating these personnel after first destroying their vehicles. Also, loitering munition strikes were coming in and hitting the vehicles as well at near or about the same time, as well as also having already destroyed these MRAPs, tearing through them like a hot knife through butter, as these MRAPs were nowhere near as well protected as the infantry fighting vehicles operated by the combat engineers, much less the even stronger M1150 armored engineering vehicles, which are based off the Abrams main battle tank chassis, as there was also racks for ERA, or explosive reactive armor, or the Tusk kits, or effectively the applique armor kits. This M1150 having some of this armor on its front in this animation or illustration is being hit by a 30mm autocannon on the side here, while a CH-901A loitering munitions coming in for a kill, as well as an ATGM, and a rocket-propelled grenade just narrowly missing this vehicle as well, while the turret gunner is trying to lay down return fire with his M250 cal, which is a powerful weapon indeed, but these vehicles would be taken out of commission exceedingly fast, leaving only the dismounted squads of combat engineers to continue the fight, as they would be fighting for their very lives trying to break out of this encirclement situation, as the light tanks, with their support from loitering munitions, had a complete command of the fields of fire throughout this area. The entire area was covered by their fields of fire, preventing any conceivable escape by these forces. The headquarters platoon of this light tank company here would also send an armored recovery vehicle and medics to pull out this vehicle, but they would do it when it was far more safe, as these vehicles pulled up closer to the combat to enable them to have an L-vectored field of fire against the dismounted infantry squads, as one Bradley IFV was destroyed immediately without being able to dismount its squad. Only 3 squads were safely dismounted before all vehicles of this platoon had been destroyed of Bravo Company, as the headquarters platoon vehicles at the same time were also being hit by light tank shells and loitering munition strikes. This platoon of Type 62G light tanks pulling into the area was again vectoring their fire in an L vector of fire with the remaining 3 light tank companies into this entire area. Again, only the waddies and washouts enabled these American soldiers, these combat engineers, to fight on a bit longer than their vehicles, but ultimately they would be ferreted out by the firepower of the light tanks combined with the loitering munitions on their AI target-seeking mode, which would slam into their positions and gradually wipe them out bit by bit, as this battle for this ranch would last approximately 30 minutes, as in the initial 5 minutes, all of the vehicles of the two combat platoons and headquarters platoon were thoroughly wiped out. At the same time, on the other side, as they had moved out towards the southwest, moving out toward the southeast, was the QRF force of ICE paramilitary forces operating their Army-gifted Max Pro MRAPs, as the Army, or Defense Department, rather, or the Department of War as it's called, would frequently gift MRAPs and other military equipment to the alphabet paramilitary forces. And in this case, the ICE forces were equipped with not just their MRAPs, but also their Black Hawk helicopters they had been gifted. As these forces of the QRF and their MRAPs had exited the facility, moving toward the southeast, they were being attacked by the Sapper Combat Recon Platoon, leading the company of sappers moving under the overpass of Highway 385, while the company that had gotten off the road first and spread out just to the north of this road had spread out with all four of their platoons, their headquarters platoon, which was their command and logistical elements in the back, with their Sapper Combat Recon Platoon and their EQ-2050s, which again were very heavily armed vehicles, and they were also up-armored versions, as well as also their Breach Platoon, which consisted of their GSL-131 armored engineering vehicles, likewise passed down from the PLA to these paramilitary forces, each one paired with a Shangji-covered truck, which essentially carried the squads of sappers along with the breach vehicles of their breach platoon, and there was a third combat platoon of just sappers and Shangji trucks, and then, of course, again, the headquarters platoon. Each of these four platoons combined together comprised the entire company of sappers. They also had their robotic forces, which were controlled by headquarters platoon troops, consisting of their total of 5 armed combat robots, as well as 5 unarmed non-combat robots. As in the fighting on the eastern side of the detention facility, the company in the northern area here had dispatched their sapper platoon, not their breach platoon or their sapper combat recon platoon, but their regular sapper platoon, to the north to head off the escape of Alpha Company's vehicles, which were moving around the north of this facility as this facility was being pounded at the opening. As again, in this entire area, many things were happening at near or about the same time, as the fighting that was breaking out in the east was going on, and in the north, so too was the fighting that was going on in the south and southwest in this ranch property between this Bravo company of combat engineers and this light tank company of the PAP Armored Battalion committed to battle in this particular sector of the battlefield. In the center, the armored infantry with their Type 86G infantry fighting vehicles, as well as also their Type 63 armor personnel carriers, each one equipped with a 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun, typically a W85, were assaulting not just the forward operating base of the combat engineers of the 150th Brigade Engineering Battalion, but also they were attacking the narrow corridor which connected the two facilities. As there were ICE defenders, mostly, defending the corridor with their Max Pro MRAPs, as well as also some military defenders which were guarding the checkpoint into and out of their forward operating base in this corridor. Some military personnel were trying to escape, with one holding down the concertina wire fencing so the others could climb over it. As they got out, they would be pounded by ISR, real-time AI battlefield data processing system-directed artillery, as the quadcopter assets of the People's Armed Police at the squad and vehicle crew level, and the quadcopter assets at the platoon level for the sapper companies of the National Construction and Production Corps were mapping this area thoroughly in real time with the high altitude assets and satellite all overlaying to provide a complete picture of everything going on the ground. Any and all movement was seen in real time and mapped in real time and dealt with in real time by all of the coalition weapon systems deployed in the area. It should be noted that the air assets, as in the rotary wing assets, the rotary aircraft rather assets of the ICE paramilitary forces, namely their two Black Hawks that were in the area at the opening of the invasion, would be swatted down by Iranian Air Force aircraft from the F-14 squadron committed to battle, as the 20-millimeter Vulcan cannon of one F-14 in the pair would shred this particular Black Hawk into pieces, while this F-14 from a bit further away and off the map to the south had fired an AIM-9 Sidewinder missile to knock this particular Black Hawk out of the sky. These would be brought down near instantaneously around 12:30 a.m. As again, much of the heaviest fighting outside of the facility, both to its general north and to its south, would occur within the first 30 minutes, while the last hour would mostly see the advance of the forces to clear the highly coveted detention facility, which again was wanted intact as much as humanly possible. As now the fighting in the ranch was unfolding, one of these squads of combat engineers had tried to get into this barn undetected, but again, they were monitored in real time by the orbiting quadcopter assets. And as they entered the barn, they would manage to fire off their platoon's Javelin ATGM out the barn door and hit this particular light tank, but not before the light tanks had fired into the barn as the squad was trying to breach, wiping out most of the squad. But one of the survivors had picked up this ATGM off of one of the KIAs and had fired it and destroyed this light tank. But the other light tanks would continue firing into this barn, with only 2 personnel surviving out of the whole squad trying to get to this light tank to drop grenades in its hatch, only to be cut down as they exited the barn by the turret machine gun on top of the tank, as the turret gunner, firing his 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun, simply mowed down these personnel. In the east, not only were the armed and unarmed combat robots advancing towards the facility, leading the way ahead of the sapper squads of the breach platoon as the 5 squads exited their Shangji trucks, they moved up along the concrete barrier of the highway to take position as the armed and unarmed combat robots went first over the highway, as they would move to effectively breach any remaining concertina wire obstacles alongside of the deployed demolition robots that were sent to effectively blast pieces of concertina wire to oblivion. The fire laid down against the guard towers by the troops, the breach troops, and the vehicles firing their Gatling Jiangxi the Jiangxi Gatling machine guns, 12.7 millimeter, were shredding these guard towers to pieces, who were only barely able to return some fire against these forces, effectively causing no real damage. However, ICE personnel holding positions in this patrol zone were firing through the portholes or the spaced out areas between the T-walls at the advancing armed and unarmed combat robots. However, they just didn't have the firepower at the moment to bring them down, as these unarmed non-combat robots were clipping away at and removing with their arms these obstacles. The armed combat robots moved in along with them to breach the area and to begin to fire through the portholes at the defenders. As the same was going on over here, the armed combat robot as it advanced was taking fire, but continued getting to the porthole to fire into it. This armed combat robot doing the same as these two unarmed combat robots removed obstacles and allowed them to fire through the area. Over on the very northernmost flank, these two armed combat robots and this unarmed combat robot clipped this barrier and entered to provide flanking fire into the side of this area, completely cutting down almost all the defenders, enabling, ultimately, these squads that had all moved into position to bound across this roughly 400-meter open deserty field separating the highway 385 from the facility to get to the walls to rappel over them and breach the facility. 3 squads would rappel over the wall, and as the armed combat robots supported them from outside, having their weapons protruding through these holes, this squad would be cut down trying to get through and reinforce their positions here. They'd be cut down by the armed combat robot just firing through, hitting them as they tried to get through this chain-link fence gate into this area, which was locked. As they tried to unlock it, they were just cut down. And as these 3 squads breached this building, there were 50 defenders, paramilitary defenders inside that had to be cleared out as the PAP would be doing the same on their side of the facility. The sappers ended up clearing the detention side of the facility. As the detainees were not enemies, particularly of the coalition forces, they would be let go, but they would be let go on their own devices. They would be told to get out of the country and get as far away as possible because their safety could no longer be guaranteed once liberated. As in, if they were seen, they might be treated like Americans are being treated and simply slaughtered. So, as they were liberated by the combat engineer paramilitary forces as they breached the facility on the east, these forces going in and ultimately freeing them from their tent holding cell areas, these vehicles would be destroyed after this building would be cleared. These forces would be firing out of the building at these personnel trying to flee the area through these gates, being cut down, and the vehicles being destroyed. On the other side of the facility, as the corridor was simply pounded by artillery as well as hit by 30-millimeter autocannon fire from the infantry fighting vehicles, as well as 7.62 by 54-millimeter coaxial fire, even the use of the rail-mounted HJ-73C ATGMs against the vehicle-based targets, such as the few Max Pro MRAPs that were trying to provide fire support with their mounted M250 cals aboard. The troops and vehicles defending this corridor were simply annihilated by the combination of artillery and vehicle-based firepower, enabling these 2 vehicles from this platoon, these 2 armor personnel carriers, Type 63s, to wheel around and lay down fire into the forces holding positions along this concrete T-wall. They would ultimately be destroyed by precision artillery strikes from the People's Armed Police Type 83 122mm howitzers, as one of 6 of their firing batteries from the 1st Brigade's battalion would focus on this particular site, pounding it with precision strikes so as not to destroy the infrastructure inside, except for the tents and the troops defending positions along the wall, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system calculated the precise coordinates for the perfect strikes. They would wipe these personnel out, as these forces had taken some fire from these positions as they wheeled around to support the advance of these 2 platoons, where they would dismount their troops, where they would begin their repelling operations into the facility. Loitering munition strikes, again, would also support this, as a total of 48 CH-901As had already been launched by the headquarters and support company of the attacking armored battalion, as their combat drone section operated the 48-tube TEL-like system and sent 48 of these heat warhead-equipped loitering munitions airborne, some of them crashing into the defenders along the concrete T-wall, shredding them to pieces. The troops, now repelling in, as two platoons would repel in, would clear the facility and its remaining buildings. The 5 defenders in this portable building would be eliminated as these 5 squads of this platoon would clear this building. Then the main building, the admin building, that had 80 defenders in it, while this platoon would clear the main parking area and heliport after this MRAP, or this up-armored Humvee, a command vehicle for ICE. And these Max Pro MRAPs were all destroyed by loitering munition strikes. The troops along the wall destroyed either by that or by fire through the portholes. The infiltration in this facility with this platoon, after these artillery shells struck this parking area and destroyed these covered trucks and these 2 MRAPs with loitering munition strikes, they entered and would hold this area down. As these troops came out of the guardhouse, they were just cut down as they briefly exchanged a few shots with this whole platoon now spread out in the parking area and the heliports, cutting these personnel down, as these personnel were also cut down by this platoon as well as they came out of their guardhouse. In the north, along this guardhouse, the northern entrance into the corridor, this platoon, after clearing these buildings, had moved through this area and cut these personnel down as they came out of the guardhouse as well, securing completely this side of the facility, while the sappers had secured this side, the detention side of the facility, as all of this had occurred after the fighting had ended outside of the facility in the first 30 minutes of high-intensity combat in the north. As Alpha Company was eradicated, although some of their squads, too, managed to get out of their Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, they, too, tried to take up positions in washouts and wadis and around rock formations, but were destroyed by loitering munition strikes, frag T shells from the light tanks who moved through this person's yard, even one light tank smashing through and destroying much of their home, this one going around, firing, destroying first the vehicles, before concentrating heavy fire against the infantrymen who were wiped out. Only one light tank from this entire northern company of light tanks was destroyed, and it was destroyed by a tow missile from this platoon's Bradleys, managing to get off one tow missile before it was destroyed. As they tried to fire their 25mm autocannons and even get off a few tow missiles, they were wiped out rapidly, as again, all of their movement was seen well before the PAP forces even arrived into the area. And as they moved in closer, so as not to be obstructed by all of the terrain features to get clear shots, they wiped out this entire platoon and its 2 dismounted squads, along with the help of loitering munition strikes, as they also had moved in onto this hilltop to get better able to fire into the facility. There wasn't much left in this facility after the massive missile, artillery barrage, and air strikes, although there were a few stragglers along the east-facing berm who would ultimately be destroyed by artillery after exchanging brief fire with these 3 squads of this sapper platoon in their Shangji trucks. In the north, as artillery was directed in and destroyed many of the soft-skinned headquarters platoon vehicles, leaving very few remaining, they were fixed in place by these 2 squads that tactically bounded and covered to the highway and fired over the concrete guardrails at the platoon of 4 vehicles, not even dismounting their squads to try to protect them in the vehicles, but they were showered with 122mm howitzer shells from the PAP's artillery, as well as also loitering munition strikes and fire from the sappers themselves, using the crew-served heavy machine guns on their Shangji trucks, but they would lose one Shangji truck to 25mm autocannon fire, along with a tow ATGM, which managed to get off one shot at this vehicle, destroying it, while the other vehicles were concentrating on the infantry, who fired ATGMs back in the form of HJ-08 man-portable ATGMs at targets. These forces were eradicated. Even also, there was a use of a single DJI disposable demolition robot, which had been driven over and detonated under one of the Bradleys, causing massive devastation and completely crippling the vehicle, at the same time as they were struck by artillery, loitering munitions, and ATGMs from the ground-based forces. It was a slaughter. All while the fighting was going on to capture this facility. This happening at the same time as the forces were just breaching the facility. Clearance of the facility itself would take roughly another hour, as the admin buildings on either side had to be fought over for control, which took time as the defenders did their absolute most to hold out the best they could under the circumstances and conditions. In the South, as all of this was unfolding, there were scouting parties from one of the 7 major militias in the area that had been sent out as a direct result of the loss of all satellite, internet-based, and also redundant forms of communication. As scouting parties were sent out on ATVs mostly, many of them blended in with the massive columns of refugees now beginning to flee their homes and take to the roads and to the countryside to get away from all of the savage, unfolding combat that was now happening everywhere in the land. Four all-terrain vehicles had managed to get into this ranch property, as they, on the map, had come from this particular militia, which had not as of yet been attacked this early in the invasion, but would be later after the first militia toward the easternmost boundary of this particular campaign battle space was already under attack at the opening by an armored battalion from 2nd Brigade of the 2nd Light Armored Division of the PAP. This militia, for the time being, had sent out scouting parties to find out what was going on throughout the area, and a grouping of 4 all-terrain vehicles even moved to the south of the Quartermaster Building Supply Material Company and the headquarters and support company of the 350th, which remained on their CCP regime property, and continued on to this particular area as they had been lured in by all of these sounds of combat. As they had moved miles to this particular area, they ended up moving in and were seen by the entire surveillance apparatus of the coalition, but were mostly ignored as they were not seen as important targets, as the primary goal was the eradication of the military and paramilitary defenders of the joint facility. However, they would ultimately be engaged as 4 personnel, as there were 2 per ATV, wanted to be heroes. They saw fellow Americans in danger. Even though these were American government or regime forces, they tried to assist by moving in to attack the Sapper Combat Recon Platoon, which had moved underneath this overpass with their vehicles to have fields of fire covering this particular area. So they had already fired at and destroyed QRF vehicles in conjunction with light tank fire, which fired at them from behind. The personnel, one of which having an American-made rocket-propelled grenade, a PSRL-1, which was made by Airtronic USA, which found its way back into America into civilian hands by the corrupt arms dealers in Eastern Europe from the Eastern European proxy conflict, selling them to Mexican cartels, which in turn turned around and sold them to these militias through straw buyers, and essentially had used one of these PSRL-1s to open fire against the lead vehicle, the lead up-armored EQ 2050, which promptly returned fire with its Jiangxi Gatling heavy machine gun. As these troops were shredded to pieces by this firepower, the other vehicle moved into place and essentially tried to open fire as well, only with lighter weapons as they had some battle rifles on them, but they too were shredded to pieces by this heavy firepower, ripped apart. The other 2 promptly fled the area to return to their AO and inform their militia command about the goings-on in this particular zone. as the combat was vicious and brutal and savage and left no survivors among the defending forces, as the People's Armed Police at this point in time were not interested in taking prisoners. The liberated prisoners, formerly of the Americans, had been cut loose by the National Construction and Production Corps personnel who had breached the facility from the eastern side and liberated the detention side of the facility. Again, they had been left to their own devices upon being liberated and were told that their safety again could not be guaranteed once they left the area, as other units might perceive them as ordinary Americans and act accordingly. They were told to do their best to flee the country and get to Mexico as fast as possible. At the same time as this massive operation was underway in the southwest of the battle space, as it would end by 2 a.m., fighting was still going on as the last stages of battle were occurring to capture the International Air and Spaceport in Midland here, as by this time the terminals were being cleared after fighting had already completed for the dual facility along 385, and even sooner than that, fighting had wrapped up against both the 106 Brigade and Support Battalion, as well as also the Alpha Company of the 1st of the 635th. At the same time as these military and even some paramilitary forces were in the process of being crushed by the PAP, and also in the case of the fighting along 385 by elements of the 350th, as the 3 Civil Engineering and the last Sapper Company had moved to the south of the airport to wait for this battle to finish up before moving in to begin construction of their megafob. There were other major objectives that were in the process of being captured, along with also flank clearance operations underway to allow for these major operations against American defenders to occur, as well as the capture of critical infrastructure such as the local international airport, as well as the municipal airports located throughout the area. As in the northwest of the battle space, there was an operation underway to capture and clear the local power plant, the Ector County Power Station, which was a gas-burning power plant, by a light mechanized infantry battalion of the People's Armed Police 1st Brigade of the larger 2nd Light Armored Division, after which assaults were to occur against another militia force that was located even further to the west. All of these operations, again, fit together like puzzle pieces and were all complementary operations, as they all served a greater purpose when all combined, making a bigger strategic picture. In the next video installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines, as the American military forces, again, were in the process of being totally and thoroughly crushed and eradicated by the coalition forces, the People's Armed Police on the ground, and the PLAAF and Iranian Air Force holding down the skies, and the missile forces providing massive firepower support to these operations on land. The paramilitary forces, kitted out in U.S. Army fatigues, tasked with defending the local municipal or the local power plant in the Ector County power plant, which was again a gas burning power plant, would be under heavy assault by the rapidly moving light mechanized infantry of a committed light mechanized infantry battalion, a wheel-based force able to move rapidly in their WZ-551 IFVs and APCs throughout the battle space, as they were tasked with the seizure of this vital power facility, which for the colonization operations to follow would be vitally important to the economic activities in the area. More to come in the next video.